And I think computer-assisted translation has seen its in it. Translation is done by machines, and we are rather revising or helping these machines to do a better job. And that semantic as computer-assisted translation, I think it will be and needs to be sunsetted.
Hello, everybody. Here we are with another brilliant episode of Merging Minds. Our guest today is Jochen Hummel. Jochen is a co-founder and CEO of Corian. He also heads S-Team, a leading language operation company. And as founder of Trados, Jochen established computer-assisted translation as a product category, which is a huge monumental achievement. So Jochen, thank you so much for being here with us today. It's a pleasure to have you. I don't know really where to get started, but would you rather tell us what you're working on now or how you got to where you are?
Well, first of all, welcome everybody. Pleasure is on my side. Thank you, Gabriel, for inviting me for this. I'm looking forward to our conversation. And yeah, I mean, people who know me know what I'm speaking about or what topics are currently moving me. It's language operations, which I think is a great concept and a good natural step in the evolution of localization. And then, of course, sunsetting CAT. You mentioned that I've established CAT as a category. It's quite a while ago, and I think it's time to replace it with something newer. Should have been done already for a long time, but now it's really time. And then, of course, cannot be avoided, unfortunately. Sorry, everybody. But we need to talk, obviously, about generative AI and how this is changing everything, changing the game, and what it means directly for our industry and for multilingual in general.
Very cool. And I'm personally curious about your trajectory, Jochen, and can you tell us a little bit about what was the landscape and what triggered you to found Trados, and what was going on through your mind, and how were the early days?
Well, as often in the life of an entrepreneur, all coincidences. So nothing was planned. At that time, I was living in Stuttgart, and Stuttgart was the location or the city of the headquarter of IBM back in the 80s. And IBM was the first company who started to localize on a large scale. And at that time, of course, it required some computer knowledge, some coding knowledge. So basically, your computer skills were maybe a bit more important than your language skills. And since they had a very hard time finding suppliers who could do that, they were looking for freelancers. So I started as a freelancer, as a translator, actually. And IBM at that time was a bit what Xerox was later or before, extremely innovative. They had everything already in those days, laser printers and XML and email and chat and you name it. But they didn't really market it so well or made it generally available. But I learned a lot there. And another thing I learned there, or got my hands on, was let's say the grandfather of all translation memory systems, at least as far as I know, which is ALPS, Automatic Language Processing System, and they had like terminology repetition files, but it was running on a very expensive hardware. It was not really user friendly and so on. But the concept was cool. That was the time where the PC started, and I thought, okay, I think we can get this on a PC. And that's how Trados started.
And what year are we talking about?
We're talking about the late 80s.
Late 80s. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so you originally began as a translator, and how was that leap from getting exposed to all this technology? Obviously, you have a super entrepreneurial mindset, but how was that leap between seeing that it was possible and actually starting out the company?
Well, we needed a framework for this, and Trados was founded to provide. Actually, it stands for, most people don't know, it stands for Translation Documentation Software, Trados. So that's where the name is coming from. And the translation piece and the documentation piece was very quickly then spun off, and the software piece remained. And of course, that was the most interesting and also more my background. I didn't study informatics, but I'm a self-taught let's say, software developer and a horrible translator. But I think software development I had some talent for. Yeah.
Very interesting. And what I'm very interested in understanding is from an entrepreneurial perspective, right? You have this great idea, and I imagine that required quite a bit of engineering, particularly at the time. How did you fundraise? Did you find investors? How was the process for actually like creating the company?
No, we bootstrapped this. So we were doing service business, which was paying the bills. And then we bootstrapped it. At that time in Germany, VC or raising capital or something for creating a startup was unheard of. So that was basically impossible. So you had to bootstrap. And it's also, I think, if you can, takes a lot of time. So it took us quite some years until Trados really became a household name. But it's a very healthy way of building a business because you really stay in control of your fate, and it always takes much longer. Also, bootstrapping took way longer than we ever thought it would. So it was a real fight and a marathon. But at least if you bootstrap, you can run the marathon. Whereas if you race, very often you have a window you have to fly through, and if you don't manage to do that, the window simply closes and you smash like a bird against the glass.
That's a very violent and accurate metaphor for sure. But can you speak a little bit about the length of time that it took versus what you expected, and how did you deal with like this? I mean, at least I'm understanding that there's quite a bit of frustration involved in, having the patience to allow the business to naturally mature. And we're talking about you were selling a product that essentially didn't exist. People didn't even have a category for it in their minds. So that even furthers that process. So I imagine, you felt all kinds of resistance and obviously a lot of interest as well and curiosity. So how long did that period take, and how did you cope with that, and what helped and what didn't help?
Well, the period took roughly a decade.
Decade. Okay.
And because we had to deal with customers, translators who said, well, I'm still dictating my translations, or I get my source text on a fax, yeah? or as a document or whatever, right? So it was very hard, but also for people to understand the concept of terminology management and translation memory. It was we had to do a lot of evangelizing, and unfortunately, I think in the end, we were not so successful in evangelizing towards the users, the linguists, because there was a lot of resistance. And I see a lot of parallels what is happening with MT and what's now happening with generative AI. Because in the end, what happened is most people said, "Well, I mean, my texts are not so repetitive, so translation memory doesn't help me." And I said, "Well, I bet your texts are very repetitive, and they are so repetitive that probably the software pays off with your very first project." They said, "No, it's always different." Blah. So I developed a tool, which in the beginning I developed it as a marketing tool, the text analysis, which was analyzing text for repetitions. So what you could do is you could just run a couple of files through, and it would tell you what kind of repetitions, 100% matches, fuzzy matches you can expect. And that was in the beginning a marketing tool where I said, look, I mean, here, it does 20% or 25% or even more is repetitive, or 50 or whatever, right? And unfortunately, that tool, or good for us, that tool was then discovered by the large customers who outsourced translations and said, wait a moment. So if this is true, why should I pay the same amount for 100% matches what I'm paying for completely new translations? So they got a couple copies of Trados, analyzed their text, and that changed the whole business model till today. And so in the end, the people who made the money, and literally billions if you add it all up, these were the big content providers and the big companies who outsourced translations. There were also a few smart translators who made a lot of money. I know a little anecdote where somebody said, "Here's my house, and Jochen, thank you. It was due to your software which bought this house or financed this house. So there were some translators who made a lot of money, but not that many. Most of them were rather kind of pushed and forced to then use this technology. And this is happening again and again and again. And the benefit of the innovation, or the benefit of being a front runner, ended up with the large customer of translation service. And same thing repeats again. We can see this again now with MT, obviously. Now with generative AI, unfortunately, probably it will be the same again.
It's yeah, it's interesting how the technological disruption and the economic disruption go kind of hand in hand, and exactly how you point out how even though the technology has the potential to ultimately like allow a translator to buy their house, for instance, based on what they generate from, typically, I don't know exactly why, how capitalism works, but in the end, the bigger player tends to use it to their advantage as opposed to the smaller player. But
Yeah,
I don't know.
yeah. I mean, if you look at the startup world, it's a bit the other way around. So in most cases, startups are way more agile and faster in adopting new technologies, and then they manage to disrupt and leave behind the large players who naturally have bigger problems. I don't know whether this is exceptional. It's a good point you raise, whether this is exceptional for our industry, but translators tend to be very conservative, rather, let's say, on the, yeah, on the, when you study on the humanities side than on the technology side, and have somehow bigger problem or bigger resistance to jump into new technologies. And the customers as well. I mean, it was also very hard sell to convince them to use translation mechanism. But once they
Mhm.
got it, and once they saw the potential and the incredible savings they could get, or the increase in consistency, which in most cases equals to quality, then of course the floodgates were opened. Then it was full speed ahead. And we will see something similar with generative AI.
Yeah, I agree. And but ultimately, you put in this monumental effort, a decade's worth of work to get, to open those gates and allow people to really see the full potential of Trados. So now we're talking about more or less early 2000s,
Yeah,
if
late
I'm
90s,
reading the
early
timeline,
2000s. Yeah.
late 90s, early 2000s. So now you're actually having a lot of success. And would you say this happened, like, from your perspective, at least from your subjective experience, did this happen kind of overnight, or was this something gradual that you could see that was
Mm,
happening?
Well, there were some, of course, some big events. So the EU made a huge call for tender. They have 4,500 translators, and they made a call for tender for a cut tool. And Trados won this call for tender. Until today, these 4,500 translators are using Trados. So, of course,
Wow.
that was an incredible multiplier, huge account. And then Microsoft bought a stake in Trados. And at that time, maybe till today, Microsoft is the biggest, or one of the biggest, contractor of translation services. And so those two events, of course, propelled our success. And because then the whole supply chains were also working with Trados. But even so, I would say it was always more about endurance and putting in the extra effort, and putting also in the extra effort in usability, in aesthetics. So make the software appealing and nice. I think Trados at that time was way ahead of competition. So, and also trying to be always at the forefront of innovation. But it was primarily endurance, I would say. Running faster, running longer than the rest of the competitors.
And eventually, you ended up, if I'm not, if I know the story correctly, eventually you ended up selling Trados to
Yes,
STL. Is that correct?
that's correct. So what we did is, I mean, till let's say '97, we were a Stuttgart-based business out of Germany, and even at that time, VC and financing, all this was a fairly new concept. But we had already opened a few offices around the globe, and then decided to move the headquarter to the US. And we thought at that time already that translation tools probably will be soon commoditized. And if you really want to grow a business, you somehow need to get your hands also on the volumes which are processed with your tools. And so we went out, raised a lot of money with the idea to create a huge online marketplace for translation services powered by translation memory. And I would say till today, I think nobody has really done this successfully. We definitely at that time were way too early with this, because what it would mean is that a large customer like Microsoft, for example, or a large US corporation would work directly with a translator in the Czech Republic or in Japan or wherever. And at that time, the internet simply didn't have the means for payment or just for connecting people working together in a secure way and a safe way. So that was a bit too early, but great idea nevertheless, and it still needs to be done. I still think most of the marketplaces we are seeing or international workflow tools are rather run by one company and are more portals to an offering of an LSP than being really a free marketplace.
That is a great idea, and it's amazing how you had that more than 25 years ago, and we're still, I would say, nowhere close to having something like that, and at least in my opinion. But you did
Yeah.
say something that catches my attention, which you were already concerned in 1997 about the technology component becoming commoditized, so
Yeah.
losing that edge. But we're in 2025, and even within the paradigm that you believe should be sunset, the whole cat tool paradigm, still don't have that many players, and at least in my opinion, it seems to be far from a commodity. It seems to be a segment that
Yeah.
very few people venture into compared to other tech. Like if you look at, let's say, um, marketing technology, and maybe you're going to find literally hundreds of different solutions, for instance, for CRMs, or thousands
Yeah.
of different solutions for CRMs,
Well,
things like that. Why do you think that feeling was accurate, or do you think I'm misunderstanding the idea of commoditization of software?
well, I mean, there were then new products coming, which are basically were copying the concept of Trados, but since there were newer developments, they could have, let's say, less technical depth and could use more modern
Mm-hmm.
platforms and so on. Basically, same stuff, but with a more modern environment or more modern look,
Mm-hmm.
maybe. And I don't know. I mean, Trados in the end, how much money did we make? What kind of revenue did we make? Did we make with cat tools? It was maybe $20 million or so.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if you raise VC money and you want to scale a business and return at that time 10x or 20x, today you have to return at least on paper 100x and more.
Mm-hmm.
Well, 20 million won't do, right?
Got it. And do you regret taking that decision of raising capital? Is this something that you would have done again? Like, if you had to replay that story in your mind, what would you have done?
At that point, I regret that decision. I think it was not the right decision because we had bootstrapped the business and we had developed a brand. Trados became a household name. And basically, I mean, if you bootstrap, you own the company. So I founded the business together with a school buddy. So the two of us basically owned the company with some minority shareholders. As I mentioned, Microsoft made an investment. So we were completely in control of our fate. And at that time, it would have been definitely smarter to build on that. And we could have easily. I mean, they always say when you raise money, you have a larger share of a bigger pie. Yeah, sometimes. Um, but sometimes it's better to have a larger share of a smaller pie.
Mm-hmm.
particularly if the smaller pie is already so big that you're kind of done with whatever personal consumption wishes you have, or what you think how much money you have to make to feel safe and feel established or accomplished.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. And then ultimately, your decision was it your decision to sell the company, or was it the investor's decision to sell the company? How did that
That was at that time, because when you start raising, of course, I mean, it was all this was fairly new to me. And if you read the small print of these contracts, they're rather complex and rather complex mechanisms. But actually, when you raise, you sign off a lot of control over to the investors. And the investors have a certain, as I said, there's a certain window. And although Trados was going fairly well through the dot-com bubble, was a good business, it was clear that it wouldn't return the multiples VCs would expect. And at that point, they often then turn their attention to the latest and greatest and newer things, which promise the 10 or the 50x or the 100x or whatever. And at that point, then very often investors are pushing for a sale or so to close their engagement.
And so now we're talking about when was this? Was this around 2006, 2007, more or less?
2005.
2005. Okay, so
Already
2005,
almost 20 years ago. Time is flying. Yeah.
almost 20 years ago. So you built this amazing company. You established the household name. You basically became, you did, in my opinion, you did the equivalent of what Xerox did with photocopying. Like essentially, Trados became synonymous with the the arts of translating with software. So did this incredible, accomplished this incredible feat, and it's, I don't know, for those of us listening and may not have an appreciation of how hard it is to get software to traction as a whole household item. I mean, that's a huge marketing and product challenge. And you did it bootstrapped. And now in 2005, the company is no longer yours. It's sold. What was going on through your mind, and yeah, how did you look at the future?
Well, actually, at that point, I was also happy to do something new. I had a very tough non-compete, so I had to anyhow stay away from this industry. Although I had already many ideas what could be done, but I had to stay away from it. But also, I wanted to do something new, and then I was looking into other interesting fields. I ended up again, and entrepreneurs often have that problem with timing. Particularly if they like tech a lot, I ended up with virtual worlds. So I created a company called Metaversum, which was creating and running an online virtual world. And a bit like Second Life, people who are a bit older maybe remember Second Life. It's still around, I think. So the idea was to have an avatar and be in a virtual world where you can meet other people, where you can socialize, trade virtual goods, do all kinds of stuff. The metaverse. The recent also had a peak again with Facebook renaming itself to Meta. But we wanted to put this into not into a fantasy place, but into a real place, and also with real people. So the idea was that you're not using some fantasy avatar like you do in games or on other platforms, but that you would be Jochen Hummel with an avatar which was generated using photos to look like me, and that you would move in your city. And that you could then create, let's say, 3D website of your shop at the address where you're at. So we were building a one-to-one copy of virtual cities using car navigation data, geo-coordinate exact with the same houses, landmarks, streets, you name it, even down to trees, and created a virtual world. Again, that technology was not mature enough at that time, particularly the bandwidth and the processing speed of the GPUs, and so on and so on. And if people are interested, the product was called Twinity, like Twin City. And if you look at it today on YouTube, it still, I think, has a better look and feel than whatever Meta came up with $1 billion budget 20 years later. Well, not quite, let's say 15 years later.
That's amazing. And so you were working back in 2005 in something that Meta decided to work on almost 20 years later, 15 years later. And
Yeah,
I'm imagining that you were a little bit too early,
a little bit.
and
Even today,
eventually
too
you,
early. Eventually, it will
yeah,
come.
for
I'm
sure.
quite convinced. But even Meta was too early, or they didn't quite, yeah, they didn't quite manage to make it attractive enough. But eventually it will come.
Yeah.
And gaming already, which moves more and more and becoming yeah, a virtual world in a way more interactive, more interaction between the users, is already bigger than Hollywood already for quite a while. And generative AI will help us to build these worlds. It was a very labor intensive work at that time. Now we can create worlds a bit like Inception, the movie, maybe you know the movie.
Hmm.
So I think the building of virtual worlds will become much cheaper, and eventually it will come. But another wave. It has to pass another generation, and then maybe next time it takes off. A bit like AI. AI had also
Yeah.
many winters and then many hype sessions. Eventually, I think now we see it. Eventually, things come together that it takes off, and the same will happen with the metaverse. We were definitely 2 decades too early.
Wow. Yeah, it's very interesting to see that vision and timing are so hard to correlate when it comes to product development, right? And you can have
Yeah,
an amazing
timing
idea, but
timing is
just too
extremely
early,
important.
too
Right?
late. Hmm.
And
Yeah.
pioneers often end up with arrows in their back. So
Hmm.
it's not always good to be the first.
Right.
Sometimes it's better to be the second or the third. You have to time it right. And of course, in business books and in war stories later, it always appears to be as something which had been planned or observed or whatever. I would say in most cases it's pure luck.
I would have to agree. I do think that things we do increase or decrease our luck, but I would agree that there's a
We
great
can
degree of randomicity in the process.
We can help luck to find us, definitely. But that's about it.
So now, fast forward till Corian and S Team. What are those two companies about, and how did you found them, and well, yeah, what are they doing?
Yeah, two observations. So, multi-term, so the terminology database of Trados was always the poor cousin, I would say, was packaged into the translator's workbench. But many people over the years have built great terminology databases using multi-term. But in a way, the concept of multi-term, the way we designed it as a concept-based terminology database, it has almost 30 years, and if you look at the first multi-term, not so much has changed, and it's still, I think, the best in class, the best in breed. So we were together with the former product manager of multi-term at Trados. I hired Michael Wetzel, and later at SDL. We're getting together, and we were thinking it's a shame that the data, the valuable data which is collected in these terminology databases, is only used for, let's say, a glorified dictionary or even a glorified Excel list of English column and French column to find the right term, because there's so much knowledge in there. But in order to make that knowledge accessible, of course, you need some sort of a knowledge structure, because these concepts in a terminology database can only be accessed lexically by looking for a term and then seeing, okay, this English term has that Spanish or French translation. But the concepts are not related to each other. So people who process knowledge, they work with knowledge graphs, so taxonomies, ontologies, and they care more about the links between these concepts, not so much about the concepts and their labels. And we thought if you bring those two things together, then you have the best of both worlds. You have the knowledge structure, which a machine can process, but you also have the labels in many languages, and then you create something what we call a multilingual knowledge system. That's what Corion is about. And also there, we do this already for quite a while. It's not so that we have thousands of clients, because if you bring two technologies together, it's great and it gives you a lot. But you also might find yourself to be sitting between two chairs, right? And obviously, the people who only do terminology might have more features and don't care so much about what you do about knowledge, and vice versa, the knowledge people. So again, you have to evangelize, explain, show use cases, and so on. It takes time. Now with generative AI, I think we have the let's say the killer use case, the killer app, because in generative AI, it has implicit knowledge. It can deal with language, but it has a hard time to deal with explicit knowledge, and of course with corporate lingo or specific terms. And these you can find in knowledge graphs. And if you, in our industry, of course, you need them multilingually. So they fit together like yin and yang. And a lot of the applications and a lot of the stuff we are doing now also in automating translation actually makes use of these multilingual knowledge systems. And the other thing, what we do in as team, I'm always
So
saying that
is that Corian or is that Esteem?
that's Corion. So the multilingual knowledge
Corian.
system
Okay.
is Corion. We have created two companies because Corion is a product. It's a software as a
Okay.
service solution, and so it's a product. Whereas in this team, we are more working on projects. So we are managing, or we're working on projects where multilingual large amounts of multilingual data have to be managed. And there we build what we call language factories. So we built, I like the factory picture. We're putting engines together. Some are we have made, others are publicly available or can be licensed, and put them together in a factory, which allows to automate the processing of multilingual data. And of course, Corium plays an important role, but also other tools. And of course, now we have the biggest or the most powerful tool ever created in our field, generative AI. And all this we put nicely together to process huge volumes of multilingual content.
Very cool. And when you talk about sunsetting the cat tool, and you're already talking about the transition from text to knowledge, what is your vision for how translators will work?
Yeah, I mean, the problem with cat tools is that I never liked the table view too much. Right? So the cat tools over the years have added more and more bells and whistles and have become very, very, let's say, feature rich, like Office or so. And in the end, the translator has been put into the middle and then taps into terminology, into machine translation, into repetitions, into translation memory matches, now into proposals from generative AI. So there's a lot of stuff, a lot of information, and it looks a bit like a C++ development studio. So you have to be kind of an engineer to understand all this. So these cut tools are very complex. And of course, by just keep adding and keep providing more sources where you can get proposals and so on, it doesn't add the needle really, move the needle really. So that's, I think, cut tools are one of the reasons why machine translation hasn't changed so much. The way cut tools have integrated machine translation is by saying, using a simple algorithm, by saying if fuzzy match is below X, 85% or whatever, well then machine translate and give me that as a proposal over the fuzzy match. Then it's just a source of another proposal. And how does this change business, and how does this move the needle? And the way I think where we are at already for years, and already machine translation should have changed a lot in our industry, is that actually machine translation in many cases is probably not, depends on how you define human parity. It's not as good as a linguist who is well informed, has all the time in the world, But it's probably as good as that what you typically get when you outsource translations, because these linguists often are paid not much and they get very tough deadlines. And often they're also not briefed very well. And so they don't have the access to the information. So machine translation, if you define human parity as this, then machine translation, I think in many cases has achieved human parity for many language combinations and types of documents. And then you don't need a CAT tool, but you actually need a revision tool. And the revision is maybe not necessarily done by a translator, but by an engineer, doctor, lawyer who's revising the translation anyhow. In many translation workflows, there's some subject matter experts in the end who's revising what they're getting back from their LSPs. And then you don't need a CAT tool, but you need actually a revision tool. And a revision tool definitely should look very different from this table view with hundreds of windows and controls you can click on, because people who revise often do this occasionally. And if you do this occasionally, you need, of course, a tool which is very simple and where you don't need to click much, but rather where you don't need to type much, but rather click confirm or make a selection of use this term or that term or these kind of things.
I agree with you in terms of vision. I just, in my opinion, again, that maybe this is just a terminology thing, and maybe we could solve it through a knowledge graph. But in my opinion, I don't see that necessarily as a sunsetting, but an evolution. I still see
Yeah,
that the fundamental paradigm of text being translated is still there. I mean, whether you're working with a super simplified view with, that doesn't resemble like a C++ workbench, or whether you're working, with something that is much closer to just actually changing things in context, like feeling like you're actually in a website and just changing things, or in an InDesign file, but
of
you're still
course.
working with text.
Yeah, of course, the sunsetting cut. I use this as a provocative term, obviously, because now I'm running two rather small companies, so I don't have the, let's say, the broad marketing power I had with Trados. So I need to tease the existing players a bit. But the T of CUT stands for translation, computer assisted translation, and I think computer assisted translation has seen its zenith. um, Translation is done by machines, and we are rather revising or helping these machines to do a better job. And in that semantic, as computer assisted translation, I think it will be and needs to be sunsetted. It also has a technology component. When I talk about CUT, of course, most people then think also translation memory. And translation memory hasn't been innovated since we decided with Trados. And the problem with translation memory is that you take these segments and you create a collection of translation units, source sentence, target sentence, but they're out of context. And already when I designed the first version of Trados, I thought it's a shame that I'm losing the context. Would be great to keep a pointer to the occurrence of the sentence in the document. But at that time, with machines which were a fraction, at a fraction of the power of today's machines, I needed the compression, because if you store a sentence which occurs 5,000 times, if you only store it once, well, then of course you compress the data. So it was simply not possible, but today it is. And the segment-based translation memory should be replaced by something what we call a content repository, where you rather store bilingual files and create an index on top of it, where translation memory is obviously a subset of the content repository, but which allows you to recycle in context. That's another more technical aspect of sunsetting cut. Yeah.
Sure. No, again, yeah, it's just I like the provocation. I just think that from when I look at it from a technical perspective, I see it as still evolutions within uh, an abstract framework that's still about text and still about going from different languages. I mean, I can still see it within the same paradigm, even though it is an evolution. Clearly, for instance, like you mentioned, going from text knowledge is a huge leap. Like if you can, scan through a translation memory instead of using Levenshtein edit distances, actually using vectors and tokens and performing deeper searches and using knowledge trees and all of that. very cool stuff. I agree that it's the future. Um, I do wonder, one thing that really puzzles me is that the more technology, it's already super hard to get technology to adopt in the first place, right? So when Trados was when you were growing Trados, there was nothing else that was an alternative, and it was still very hard to get people to adopt, even though the gain was monumental, even though Trados generated billions and billions of dollars for savings, and both from companies like Microsoft and IBM, and also huge agencies that adopted it. But as software gets adopted, it often even gets harder to adopt newer software because now people are used to, let's say, this baseline of cat tools and repetitions and propagation, blah blah blah. All this, there's already. I mean, people have literally invested sometimes 20 years of their life learning this and getting good at this, and companies implementing this. And now, for people to switch to a different paradigm, it seems like the bar gets even higher. Now it's even harder, let's say, for people. Let's say we were to develop jointly a segmentless editor that just looks beautiful, doesn't work anymore with um, with match levels, works only with maybe knowledge levels or confidence levels, like a much more evolved paradigm of what translation looks like. And let's say this version can actually this software can actually deliver much better translations, much faster, and much less expensive, right? The value proposition is there. In my opinion, even if this were available today, and even if we went to market with this today, we would still have a very hard time convincing people that they should switch, that this
Yeah.
is better, that they should give up on whatever tech stack they have built. And now they start thinking about their supply chain and how do I pay my people for this and how do I train my project. I mean, these are such big considerations that even in a scenario like this, I would still see us, easily scrambling for a few years, if not a decade, to get people to wrap their heads around it. So I guess my question to you is, do you agree with what I'm saying? And if so, why? Is there something that can be done to accelerate adoption or change management when it comes to technology?
I totally agree with this because I suffer this daily when I try to sell our solutions and market our technology. Indeed, existing solutions are having a tendency to live way longer than you would think. And because people hate to change, I'm always saying everybody talks about innovation, but actually, when it hits them and they have to change, and sometimes the change is obvious. I mean, just look at the combustible engine and electric cars, right? It has all the advantages in the world, and still there's such a resistance because it's just different, and you have to change. Most people hate to change. And that's where the term disruption, which is overused, and everybody talks about disruption, but that's where the term disruption makes sense because many people will not change. They will refuse change, and in the activity we are doing in translation localization, often also the let's say the costs involved of not changing are not high enough to really that somebody on the C level cares. If a company has, let's say, a budget of 10 million translation costs, and you say, well, with our solution, we can cut 30% off, and it's 3 million. Well, there are probably other projects where you're competing with where it's 30 million or 300 million, right? And obviously nobody then cares about the 3 million. It's just like, let's keep it's working, it's running, so why should we change it? 3 million is not good enough to change. But eventually, it bites you. And of course, there are many examples of companies, and there's this great book you probably have also read, "The Innovator's Dilemma." Eventually, it hits you, and that's where disruption, the word disruption, is justified because eventually somebody, some outsider, comes and who was long overseen, and suddenly that outsider destroys your business. And so it's dangerous, obviously. And I think now with generative AI, we will see an acceleration of the speed of disruption, and whoever's not really rethinking and reconsidering all this and understanding the bigger picture And that's where langops, language operations, comes a bit into the play. If it's only about translation, okay, then you're with your 3 million. But if it's about being able to manage multilingual data, where linguists and LSPs or translation departments are actually delivering the linguistic assets to be able to manage multilingual data, then it suddenly becomes way bigger. And then it's not about translating, but it's about being able to understand your customers globally, independent of what language they're speaking. And Gen AI gives us the tools to do that, and we could deliver the linguistic assets to do that, but only if we start to kiss our old tools, the translation memories and terminology databases and TMSs, goodbye, because they won't cut it, and they need to be replaced by more modern tools, which can actually support the generative AI applications to a degree that they can really deliver what they promise.
I agree. And then we also have the economic constraints, which is a lot of these improvements or changes, they actually generate a decrease in top line value. So, for instance, if I am to translate, let's say, using a software that really is able to um, extract so much more from translation memories and glossaries and like work with knowledge, work with the knowledge that I'm generating from my global customers and work within this much bigger paradigm. Let's say if I'm an agency and I'm currently making $5 million a year from a given customer, in this given paradigm of extreme efficiency, maybe I won't only be able to make now 2 million or 3
Yep,
million from that same customer
that's
because I'm
already
generating that level of efficiency. That's not
that's
very
already
interesting
happening.
for, it's already happening, but it's not very interesting for shareholders, not very interesting for people, investors, to see, let's say, that top line decrease. So you see the exact opposite. So instead of trying to move towards more modern paradigms, you still see this kind of like clinching on to older paradigms, making sure maybe making it a little bit more efficient here or there, adding more discounts here and there, but not fundamentally restructuring how the service operates. And
Yep.
I guess my question is, in your opinion, like when you're talking about eventually it hits us, do you think companies that don't move in this direction eventually will be swallowed by companies that do? Is that kind of like your perspective?
Swallowed or push aside. They become irrelevant. I think many companies will live their Kodak moment. Kodak is a great example. I mean, it's not so that Kodak didn't understood electronic um, imaging and electronic cameras. Actually, they invented larger part of the technology. So it's not so that they were blind or just ignoring it, not seeing it. But what they didn't manage is to adopt their business model to take these new things on. There were for a time there were these Kodak engines where you could print the photos you made electronically, but all this didn't save one of the most valuable brands of the world. What Kodak should have done is they should have invented Pinterest. Yeah? That would have been the right thinking, right? But well, sell this then to your, as you said, to your shareholders, where you live off selling films and developing these films. And then suddenly you say, you know what, we shouldn't because people won't print them anymore. They will rather publish them on the internet. Of course, the shareholders will say, hey, I mean, you're destroying our business, right? And that's the innovator's dilemma. Most companies, even if they clearly see it, in case of Kodak, it was a painful, long death, which took like 1 or 2 decades. Um, in many cases, it's there's no way out really. Another good example is Microsoft. They would have gone a similar way, but it requires a once in a century or a couple in a century CEO to turn a desktop company into a cloud company. There are only a handful of CEOs who manage to, against all these resistance, to change such ship and change course. But it's one of the few examples where this worked. Typically, companies simply become irrelevant. and I
or
push
less
this.
relevant, or very little relevant. Yeah, Kodak is maybe an extreme example, but you do have a lot of companies who lose tremendous value and things like that. But in your opinion, Jochen, we're in 2024, second half already. And I still hear, for instance, translators saying that they don't trust AI, that it's not secure, that it's not safe, that they can only keep files in their desktop. So we're working with these very rigid mindsets and ideologies that people believe in. And then, based on, if I understand correctly, what you're saying is like, if you don't, if you don't take steps towards innovation, eventually it catches up with you and you're
Yeah,
toast.
and will catch up
Mhm.
with you in a speed which is unprecedented. Yeah. I think the speed is which this new technology is developing, it's breathtaking. And I love Gen I, and I'm totally also personally technologically excited about about this invention, what it does and what it can do. But it's breathtaking. And I think nobody, even the most innovative people, can really tell what we will see in a couple of years and what it means for the business. It's all speculation. I think one thing is for sure, it will change everything. And all these arguments which are brought against it, um, I would say people are trying to comfort themselves with these arguments. And that's what I said in the beginning when we pushed translation memory into the market. There was similar arguments, and only that it took way longer. But some people bought a new house, and others saw their word rates declined by fuzzy match discounts.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting how the same technology has the potential to create such positive economic impact, and at the same time, such amount of negative economic impact, depending on what end of the stick you are, and also how you how you implement it for your own life. And for instance, just as an example, like we're likely to see per word rates, they should go down very significantly over the next few years. But if or what's going to happen, either productivity standards are going to increase, but whatever, however you value time put into translation, human time, that productivity, the expected productivity out of human time will increase by many fold, many orders of magnitude over the next coming years. And
I mean, the
again, it's
theory
the
is
difference between Mhm.
the theory is if you have a tool which makes the task more productive, in the end, everybody benefits. And in the beginning, when Gen AI came out, I was also thought, oh, I mean, what will this do to society, and what will all these people do eventually? But in a country like Germany, with an aging society, and we're not the only country having that problem, there are millions and millions of people who will leave the labor force in the coming years, and we are already seeing it now. The shortage in labor, not only in restaurants or hotels or so on, but everywhere, also qualified labor. And I think Gen AI is an incredible opportunity for us, and a way to maintain our level of welfare states and our level of welfare and GDP and economical power, even with the decreasing workforce. It might always overshoot, but for now, I think we might have the opposite problem, and Gen AI is a possibility to close these gaps, these increasing gaps of qualified people. And the same is true in translation, because the amount of content, of course, continues to grow. And with Gen AI, you can also produce way more content. And if globalization is not reversed as a mega trend, which could happen, but let's not hope that this will happen, then there will be so much content which needs to be translated. And then Gen AI is the only way to do this anyhow.
Yep. No, that makes a lot of sense. I think that, the analogy that I can think of is if both of us are grass cutters and I cut my grass by hand, and you have a mowing machine that allows you to go so much faster. Obviously, you're going to get my business because you're going to be able to charge a lot less and you're going to be able to do a lot more. But I think the key thing that you're talking about, which is super important, which I think a lot of people forget, is because of the economic constraints, there's so much more grasses that want to be cut than people actually afford to cut. So if you're able to cut grass for a lot less than I can, you're going to be able to make it accessible for all that additional grass, so for all this additional content that doesn't get translated, for all these languages that don't get translated just because of economic constraints. Once those economic constraints get relaxed, now you have a lot more, bigger market. So I don't know if you see it that way, but I think that's
Yeah,
kind of what I heard in what you said.
and I mean, we did talk a lot about translation, but our industry is often thinking about unidirectional communication. You have a content owner and they want to broadcast their content. And obviously, if you broadcast a program in France, you have to do it in French. Yeah? But nowadays, customers can talk back and they are encouraged to talk back. And there are many channels to do so. But who's listening? If you talk back to a big company, to a big American company, and I do this in German or French, who's listening to these customers? I'm afraid not many. So if you don't talk the corporate language of the people who provide these products, it's quite likely that you are unheard, which is bad for you. It's also bad for the company. So if we would redefine a bit the things, the service we are delivering, what we are actually enabling, not in a unidirectional but a bidirectional communication, then we go way beyond translation. But we actually help companies not to be understood, but to understand. And obviously, the only way to do this is by using AI and text analytics and all these tools. And all these tools only work if you teach them the terms and give them the linguistic assets. So I think in that area, there is so much work for linguists, which is also way more interesting and a way bigger multiplier than doing words or doing pages. And that's where I see the future of our profession. And I think there will be endless amounts of work to make this happening. So the only people who will suffer and the only people who will really have a hard times are the ones who are now coming up with all these self-comforting arguments why they think Gen AI will not change the world. Those people will have problems. And for the rest, I think the future is pretty nice.
That's a nice hopeful twist at the end. And Joachim, I'm a huge fan. I love our conversation. Again, I have the utmost respect for you. In my opinion, you created the arguably the most the biggest disruption in our space ever, and I think that's incredible. And
Thank you. Thank
like
you
I
for
said,
the nice words.
I'm an admirer and very grateful for our conversation, and really look forward to people asking questions, liking and subscribe if they like this episode. And Joachim, if people want to reach you, what's the best way to find you? What's the best way to contact you if they want to know more about Corian or
Well, you
his
can
teams?
always send me a message on LinkedIn, or I'm Jochen@corian.com or Jochen@esteem.se. Like it's a Swedish company. I didn't found Esteem. Esteem was founded by Gudrun Magnusdottir and Lambos Kreinos many years ago. So I co-founded Corian, but Esteem I'm actually joined later. So it's a Swedish company, therefore Jochen@esteem.se. But if you find this too complex, just ping me on LinkedIn. And yeah, as you have seen, Gabriel, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk about these things. Even after all these years in this industry, I'm still very excited about these topics. I love to talk about this. And I'm so happy about these recent technological developments, because it makes our industry one of the most exciting and one of the most hottest on this planet. And that's something which is new. Suddenly, language is the hottest topic, and that's great.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Joachim, for all your time. Thank you, everybody, for watching another great episode of Merging Minds.
Thank
And
you.
till next time. Okay.
Bye bye.